All right, I'm not going to be able to repeat that, but there there is some redundancy in my presentation. I'll repeat myself a little bit. So I'm going to talk about my personal experience because I think that kind of gives you my perspective and my experience directly with being a person with a visible, significant disability trying to secure employment. And again, somebody said, well, you don't even have a disability. Maybe because I have been able to overcome it and I have worked really hard. And I think that will help everybody. So I was, of course, injured in 1982 in a motor vehicle collision caused by a drunk driver. And I was 3 weeks out of high school. I was 17 years old, and I was on my way to the United States Military Academy. And just like that, in an instant, my life changed. And I was in a coma for 8.5 weeks. I was paralyzed from the waist down. So I had to learn how to do many things over again, had to rewire my brain. So I attended college and law school using a wheelchair before the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I have suffered some employment discrimination. So when I talk about these laws and the impact and the prohibitions or the rules against discrimination, I have firsthand experience of why we need them. Of course, and I'm going to tell you about some of my first jobs and how I got those jobs. And of course, I've experienced public perception of people with disabilities. What I call the $5 episode, where I was practicing law in downtown Birmingham. I had a nice suit on. I had the white shirt and the pinstripe suit and the black high polished shoes. I'm on a street corner, and somebody comes up to me and puts a $5 bill in my pocket. They only saw the wheelchair. They didn't see the lawyer in the wheelchair, and so they thought I was on a street corner, so I must be begging. And you're probably wondering, what did I do with that $5? I kept it, of course, just so you know. Okay, so, but it's about, we cannot allow decreased expectations for people with disabilities, no matter what. But everybody has different levels of disability, different experiences. So I'm talking very globally. And people with disabilities want to live the American dream. You really need to have a job to live the American dream. You cannot live off government benefits. Now, we have something called getting people in the primary labor market. There's also something called approximation of the primary labor market. That's where somebody could have government benefits plus a part-time job, and then the two together would help them be closer to the American dream. So now, I was always told, if you want to be rich, marry somebody that's rich or inherit it. Well, not going to happen, so I had to get a job. So there you go. All right. The employment statistic. Next slide, please. 17, this is according to the most recent statistics I pulled up, 17.9% of people with disabilities were employed in 2020, which means over 80-something were not employed, a decrease from 19.3% in 2019. So I think COVID has even adversely impacted people with disabilities as far as employment than the rest of the population. And those figures came from the Federal Bureau of Labor Statistics within the United States Department of Labor. So generally 70% of individuals with significant disabilities are unemployed. So, and I think that's still a good statistic. I've been saying that same statistic year after year after year. I would really like to see an improvement in that area. And again, this is unacceptable. Next slide. This gives you perspective. My goal today in discussing employment with you is outline legal. All right.
Keeps jumping on and off there.
It just keep you guys awake. So you'll be like, I'm going to fall asleep, then it's going to come back on, it's going to wake you up again. So, but again, my goal in discussing employment with you is outline legal and practical information. So I think legal information without practical information is not very useful. I also want to, again, as I said before, share my personal experience. My first job was an accounts receivable clerk. It was the summer between the time when I graduated from the University of North Alabama in 1987, and I went to law school in August of that summer at Vanderbilt Law School. And I knew one of my fraternity brothers. He was an accountant, and he worked for Anderson News Company. And Anderson News Company owns Books A Million. And so I did some of the accounts receivable work for Books A Million. And we had to take these books and we had to add up all these things on ledgers. As before you had laptops, you actually wrote things down by hand. But that was the first time that I had worked a job from 8 to 5. Because all my other jobs in high school before I was injured were mowing grass and stuff like that. The first time I had to be somewhere the same time every day and leave at the same time every day. And there's something called work hardening. And when you're a college student, you got the late classes. You didn't get classes on Friday when you could. And then you stayed up late at night and you got up late the next day. When you're working a job, you can't do that. So that gave me some real experience early, and I got that job because of people I met through a network. A lot of employment people get because of who they know. You often heard it's not what you know, it's who you know. I think it's both, okay, but that certainly helped me. And my first job was an associate attorney at a law firm in Birmingham. And I got that job when I was still in law school. So when I actually graduated, I already had a job. And I got that job through interviewing, but one of the things they asked me, they said, "We notice you're in a wheelchair." And I said, "Boy, these are bright people." I'm just kidding. "We notice you're in a wheelchair." So I said, "Okay, I'm in a wheelchair." And they said, "We need you to go to all these courthouses around the state and argue these cases." It was insurance defense. They had people that were insured by the insurance company called insureds, and they were all over the state. And so I said, "Okay, let me show you something." And so I took them out to my car. I pulled the door open. I hopped in the car from my wheelchair. I folded up my wheelchair, put it behind the seats, showed them the hand controls, and I had a Honda Accord at that time, so it didn't peel out like my car will now. So otherwise I would have gotten in there and peeled off and then came back and said, "See, I can get there and quickly too." So, but I demonstrated to them. I knew that they were going to have an issue with that because there weren't a lot of people driving with hand controls in the 80s. There's not a lot of people driving with hand controls now just because the number of people with disabilities that are drivers versus the rest of the population that are drivers. But again, that was one tip I can give you under employment is to anticipate what the issues might be and address those ahead of time. Say, now you might be wondering, I'm missing an arm here. Now you might be wondering that I'm not going to be able to do this, but people demonstrate. People with disabilities, we are problem solvers, and we can come up with innovative solutions on how to do things. Next slide, okay? Now this is a picture. See if you can get the picture up there too. Yeah, click again. There you go. I don't know if you can see that. That was me in my first job. I was 25 years old, many moons ago. Yeah, 25 years ago. So, and that's me in front of my law books in my office there. And I sent out a large number of resumes to a whole bunch of law firms in the Birmingham area using something called Martindale Hubble. And I looked up the firms and I decided that's the kind of firm I work for. I got rejection letters from law firms that I didn't send resumes to. And we called those stray bullets. Those are called stray bullets. So I got a bunch of stray bullets. Talking about deflating your ego. I didn't even apply there and I got rejected. Come on, I didn't have a shot. So, and again, at one firm where I interviewed, I got to the managing partner, the last person in the interview. All the other partners liked me, but that old man said to me, he's probably my age, I am now, but that, because I could say that when I was 25, that old man said, "Why do you want to work? You can live off the government." That would not even paid my law school 1 month's payment for law school at that time. So you know, there's no way you can live off the government. People don't realize if you've never worked, you've never paid Social Security, you got SSI. SSI isn't that much a month. So, and I think when I was getting SSI in college, I got $189 a month. So, and that's not even a good steak dinner out with some wine at a restaurant today. So anyway, I clerked for 2 large law firms during the summer, and they interviewed us at the law school. I got hired, got a lot of good experience, made some connections. You know, employment is truly the great equalizer. It's often the first question when somebody sees you. They don't go, you know, I like your shoes, you know, unless you're a woman. I'm just kidding. They'll say to you, you know, what do you do? Do you want to say, well, you know, I live at home with my parents and I'm 50 years old? No, and that's okay if you do. I'm not saying that's wrong if you do, but most people want to say, yeah, I got a cool job, I'm working here, you know, this is what I do. A lot of times employment defines who you are. And it's, again, I talked about the relationship between employment and the American dream. Now, everybody can do something, I think. People can have something to offer. There's different ways to do it. And so, and people look at me and say, well, you had all the perks and all that. I'm trying to demonstrate to you I didn't. I had to go to school. I had to learn things. I had to kind of build myself up to the ranks like other folks. So, and again, I got this on there. I didn't mention disability on my resume. And then it was a 1-page resume, never mentioned disability. They didn't know I was a wheelchair user. They would call back, say, we'd like to interview you. Would you come to Nashville? Or would you come to Birmingham? I was living in Nashville. They say, would you come to Birmingham? And I'd drive up there in a day, you know, 3 hours there, 3 hours back, but I was, you know, it wasn't a bad trip. Less traffic on the Interstate 65 in the 80s, and they'd offer me the job. And so, but again, I'd always say when they call back, said, by the way, does your building have an elevator? They said, yes, we're downtown Birmingham. All these buildings have elevators. And that was the only time I ever mentioned anything related to my disability. So next slide, please. The caveat is this, though. This is what I kind of alluded to at the beginning of my remarks here. The anti-discrimination employment provisions in the ADA have not led to greater employment for people with disabilities. Because your best argument isn't that, hey, here's the ADA, you have to hire me. If you don't hire me, it's discrimination. Employers, they have stuff they need to get done. They want you to do that stuff. You can show them that you can do what needs to be done, you're more likely to get hired than to lean on the law. Now, if you're discriminated against, that's the time to lean on the law, but not before. So the best act would appear to emphasize qualifications over rights, and I mentioned that before. All right, just give me a minute here. All right. The next slide, please. And here's a real quick, you can do all of them, just push them all down. There you go. All right. The first, these are the disability specific laws, of course, the Americans with Disabilities Act. You all are probably going to hear a lot about that law, but it was passed in 1990. That was after I had, a couple months after I had been graduated from law school, July 26, 1990. The ADA Amendments Act, 2008, that was basically to correct what the United States Supreme Court had done to the ADA and narrowed it, and it restored basically the law. At one time, it was going to be known as the ADA Restoration Act. And of course, the Rehabilitation Act 1973, Section 501. Now you're like, wait a minute, what about Section 504? Section 501 actually has anti-discrimination employment for the federal government. And I've talked to a lot of folks. You know, a lot of people with disabilities can get successfully employed in government positions. And the federal government's looking for qualified people with disabilities to hire. And a lot of federal government agencies have an affirmative action duty to hire qualified people with disabilities. So, again, the only job I interviewed at the federal government first was the United States Postal Service. I went there to interview for the general counsel job at LaFont Square there in Washington, D.C., and I picked I went up there in January, and it was so cold. I went up there, I flew up there, one of the first times I'd flown on an airplane after I became a wheelchair user. So, next slide, please. So I'm trying to give you all these little stories to make the law entertaining for you and mesmerizing. So, of course, the ADA overview, these are all things, mainstreaming. We know what that means, full inclusion, people with disabilities, working with people without disabilities. In fact, the law, when I talk about the vocational rehabilitation services, was created by the Rehabilitation Act. And the last time the law was updated was something called the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act. And the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act. So we got somebody already like my presentation. That's good. I like that enthusiasm. So, but mainstreaming is very important. It's something we want people with disabilities working with people without disabilities, something called competitive integrated employment. It used to be competitive employment. That was to have a successful closure in the vocational rehabilitation program. They added integrated to it. And the idea was that people with disabilities would work with people without disabilities. And how do you learn more about somebody that's different than you than to be around them and work with them? And then it's not that big of a deal. But if you only saw one person with a disability in your entire life, then you're shocked when you see it and you're like, wow, but it's not seen as something that's normal like it is. It's part of the mainstream. So equal opportunity means equal opportunity to participate. The Americans with Disabilities Act is not affirmative action. It does not guarantee people with disabilities jobs. And of course, it's about access. Physical access, people think because I use a wheelchair, I'm just concerned about, the accessible bathroom and the parking. I even saw a t-shirt one time, I'm in it for the parking. Yeah. It's too heavy of a burden just for parking, though, I will tell you this. So, but access, the other side of that is communications access. Making sure people that are blind and deaf and have learning disabilities, that we communicate with them. So civil rights, of course it's a civil rights law. It is what I call the premier civil rights law. I class it even more important to me than the Rehabilitation Act. So next slide, please. We have the 5 titles of the ADA, and the good news is, I'm not discussing all this, but I wanted y'all to be able to pass the test at the end, because all these will be on the test. You ever had those classes where the teacher tested you on stuff they didn't even teach? I always thought that was a ripoff, But if you knew if it was in a footnote somewhere, it was going to be on the test, okay, in the smallest print. So, and this is very small print, so it's going to be on the test, okay. But employment, I'm just talking about employment. So the next slide, please, sir. And this is the definition of disability. I wasn't going to spend any time on this, but of course, this is the gatekeeper. These 3-pronged definition, somebody meets any one of these. Typically, we think of physical or mental impairment, but also we have people out of the record of that had a past history of a disability, like people with cancer that goes into remission. Then, of course, people that don't actually have a disability, but they're treated as having one. So, next slide. Then, of course, rights and responsibilities. There's a duty not to discriminate against qualified individual with disability. The ADA doesn't protect all people with disabilities. It only protects those who can perform the major job task or essential functions with or without reasonable accommodation. There's a lot of terms in the ADA. You probably noticed that, but qualified is one you really need to understand the employment provisions. And it includes all terms and conditions of employment, not just whether or not you get hired, but also the application and interview process. The ADA prohibits any questions relating to disability when you're being interviewed or on the application. But I can challenge you, I bet you can go on any website, if you see an application, it has questions relating to disability. I think a big corporation in this country, I'm not going to list which one because they might have fixed it by now, but they had on their application, list any one of these disabilities that you have. that's clearly in violation of the law. But again, we as people with disabilities need to be educated, informed, so when we see stuff like that, we can say something and say, you know, you need to correct that. That's not, you know, that's not the way to do it. So, of course, reasonable accommodation for the job, fringe benefits. Reasonable accommodation is the great equalizer. One time, somebody asked for an accommodation, and so the employer called up the hotel and got him a room. They said, this isn't the kind of accommodation I was talking about, okay? I was talking about a reasonable accommodation, not a hotel room. So, but reasonable accommodation enables a lot of people with disabilities to get the job. For me, when I was in practicing law, I couldn't get under the desk because it was too low in my wheelchair. And so what the law firm did they buy me a new desk that was higher? No. They took some old law books and put them under the table legs and raised the desk up. And they said, when you make some money, we'll buy you a new desk. So I had to work there about a year and made some money, and they bought me a new desk. So the idea of reasonable accommodation doesn't have to be the most expensive thing. It has to be effective. It has to work. So, and again, the employee with disability has duty to maintain the job performance standards. They have to be able to do the job, okay? And if you need accommodation, you have to request it. You don't have to use the magical words of reasonable accommodation. You can say, I'm having difficulty doing this. Can you help me can I have this to help me do that particular function of the job? So again, this isn't a complete list of all the things under the ADA. This is the Ultra Reader's Digest version. Excuse me. Make sure that gets on the recording. Thank you. All right. Next slide. The Title I general rule, okay? Prohibits discrimination against qualified individuals with disabilities, and I already said it was persons with disabilities that perform the essential function of the job or major job tasks. It only covers employers of 15 or more employees. I've never really understood why they did under the ADA, why they limited the size of the employer, except the Civil Rights Act of 1964 has the same 15 numbers. So, and again, I said it's not affirmative action. They can still hire the most qualified person for the job. Let me give you this scenario, and this happens a lot. You have two people that apply for a job. One has a disability, and one does not have a disability. And the person without a disability is more qualified. Can the employer still hire the more qualified person? Of course. Now, what if they're both equally matched? That never happens, okay, because people said, shouldn't they hire the person with a disability? I would say at that time, maybe flip a coin and say, well, it's heads or tails. And if you guess tails, you're wrong because it's mostly heads, okay? So make sure, that's the other thing you have to do in life is make good choices, okay? You like that, don't you? Very good. I like that guy. He's helped me out a lot today. So anyway, and the ADA does not mandate, again, that employers hire individuals with disabilities. So make sure that is definitely going to be on the test at the end, okay? All right, about 10 more slides to do here. I'm just kidding. More stuff on next slide, terms, conditions of employment. But again, I already mentioned about not being able to ask questions relating to disability. Employers should focus on the ability to do the job. So you make it easier on our employers by telling them how you can do the job. And of course, employers have a duty to provide accommodations, not just to do the job, but also to access the privileges and terms of employment. So if there's an employee break room and it's downstairs, they got to provide some access there or relocate the break room so people with disabilities could access that. One area is insurance. Insurance is an area that if employers provide insurance to employees without disabilities, they have to provide the same amount. Now, the area that we haven't seen a lot of movement on is the difference between physical and mental disabilities. Mental disabilities, there's a law in the books saying there should be parity. That people with mental disabilities should get the same level of coverage as people with physical disabilities. So, next slide, employee obligations. Where a disability is hidden, an employee has a duty to disclose disability where there's a need for accommodation. Now, it's Shakespearean. The question is to disclose or not to disclose. That is the question. So a lot of times it's a judgment call. If I'm applying for a job and I don't have a visible disability and it doesn't impact my ability to do the job, I wouldn't even mention my disability. But of course, if you're using a wheelchair like mine, even if I put really Mac Daddy tires on it and put some curb feelers on it, they're still going to see it, okay, even if it is kind of trying to disguise it, you know, and they're going to know that I'm a wheelchair user and I must have a disability, okay? Even though it is pretty cool using a wheelchair, I always say that, and, you know, there was actually a group of people down in Florida that were what we call wheelchair masqueraders. They would actually get in wheelchairs and they didn't have disabilities. That's true. I'm not making that up. So, all right, and again, I always add cases in here. Canopco is just a case. The employee with a disability has to identify a specific accommodation. They can't just say, I'll do anything. That's specific, and that shows that it's reasonable too. So if you ever get in a situation where you're on a job and you need help identifying accommodation, you can call my office. I can help you, or I can get some people, some boots on the ground that will go to your work site and help you to work that out. So, all right, VR services, and we're about to wrap up. Let's see how much time I got. All right, that's good. So I get to go till 4:45. You know, it's not 4:45. So, you know, I want to give you your money's worth, okay? Because I have to earn my chocolate shake, okay? So here you go. So VR services, again, VR has as its central purpose, vocational rehabilitation services, you know, getting jobs for eligible individuals with disabilities. And eligible persons are people with a physical or mental impairment that is a substantial impediment to employment and who need VR service to retain, maintain, or enter, or retain, or even advance in employment. I didn't have the advance in employment in there, so I'm adding a little bit extra here. So again, not everybody's going to be eligible, but if you're not eligible, there's other resources out there that somebody could be referred to. So vocational rehabilitation process. You used to have a lot more steps to it. It's basically you apply for it. How do you apply for it? You can meet the VR counselor there in the office. You can apply over the phone. A lot of times VR counselors are assigned by zip code. You tell them what your zip code is, that's the VR counselor. So, but the support employment program, there's different counselors that do that. So again, eligibility, they then look at the information that's in the application. A lot of times, if people have, a lot of times they will need medical information. If you already have your medical information, you can bring it with you, and that may speed up the process. Of course, there is the individualized plan for employment. This lists the services that vocational rehab will provide to you to help you get to a vocational goal. And you need to work with a vocational rehabilitation counselor to decide on a vocational goal. But there's something called informed choice that goes throughout the whole VR program. And that's the idea that the consumer makes the choice, but the vocational rehabilitation counselor, they have to sign off on the individualized plan for employment. So it's a team effort. VR counselors have master's degrees, and they're trained in helping people identify jobs that match their strengths and abilities, and also take into account limitations. So it's like Clint Eastwood said, a man, and I'll say a person, okay, has to know their limitations, okay? So, all right, so that's one. And then, of course, after the plan, then when all the services are provided and somebody gets a job, it can be closed. And sometimes the case is closed without somebody getting a job, because sometimes the person doesn't cooperate, they don't do the training, they don't finish the training, there's different, or they don't. Some people disappear. We've had people disappear where you couldn't find them. You know, and you got, again, I said before, it's kind of a team effort. So, but again, closure, the case can be closed after 90 days of successful employment. So, and I was a vocational rehabilitation client back in 1983. And remember, the 80s weren't that long ago, okay? Right? So, in 1983, VR helped because they helped pay for my physical restoration, my back surgery, my physical rehabilitation. They helped pay for some of my college education. And I wouldn't be where I am today without the services that I received from vocational rehabilitation. So they helped me out a lot. So, all right, that's all. You know, it's like Porky Pig, that's all, folks. So what kind of questions do you have? Any comments? Sure. You want the mic?
No, I think they can hear you. I'm retired military.
All right. Thank you for your service, man.
Also, I'm retired civil service.
Okay, well,
And so,
then you know. Yes.
So I've worked on a lot of jobs in the civilian sector where we had people that were disabled. And I thought there was something where there was a percentage of the job that they had to give to somebody that's disabled.
Well, there's different, not under the ADA, okay? In the private sector, if it's not a government job, there can be, if it's a federal contractor, they were trying to, the percentage, the goal was 7%, but it was a, quote, goal. Yes, yes.
Yeah, there were several people that were disabled that they had to hire. Just like they got a program for military too.
Right. And that's pretty what we call affirmative action hires. And that's Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act, where you have private employers that have federal contracts of more than $10,000, which, you know, that's, most of them are easily more than 10,000. Like Alabama Power is an example of a federal contractor. So there's different entities that are, not Alabama Power, saying Regions Bank, I'm sorry. Regions Bank is an example of a Section 503 federal contractor. So for purposes of the video, scratch that about Alabama Power, okay, reverse, okay. I was thinking about Alabama Power in another instance, so, but I think Alabama Power has hired a lot of people with disabilities, so they're open, because that may be one of the accounts, the employer accounts that vocational rehabilitation has. We have what we call business relations consultants that go out there and work with businesses and identify employers that are interested in hiring people with disabilities. So, and what other questions or comments? Thank you for that, sir. Thank you. Yes, Kim Spangler, go ahead.
There's new information coming out, so I don't know if it's relative right now. But when COVID started, everybody started working from home. Sorry. Okay. When we all started working from home with COVID, we started understanding that there was this big need for plain language translation for people with cognitive impairments. If you went to an employer and you could work from home, would a reasonable accommodation request be, can you put this website or this information, maybe even it's just the application itself, into plain language, or would that be a special accommodation?
And I think so. Reasonable accommodation applies to all aspects of the employment process, and so if somebody's applying for a job, is that what you're talking about? One example. I think that could be a reasonable accommodation. I think it depends on how extensive that is, but at least the main parts of that website could be in plain language, and they probably should use that as a best practice anyway, because the websites are accessed by so many different types of folks that I think it's a good idea. So a reasonable accommodation is on a case-by-case basis, so it depends. When I taught law school classes, they gave me a shirt that said, "It depends," because that's the best question, because it depends on that. It depends on the resources of the employer, and whether or not that's a reasonable accommodation. But I would say most likely it would be. I was reading a case this morning, and they were told to redo their website to make it accessible to blind folks. An actual case, it was Gill versus Winn-Dixie. It's 11th Circuit case law, and they held that websites weren't covered by the ADA with respect to private businesses. And so the law is developing on websites and what all is required, okay? But I think you should make the request, that the person makes the request, and then they determine if it's reasonable or not, okay? But I think if you have outside parties that could help the employer, understand what plain language is, okay? Because it might be different. Some people understand it to be on a certain grade level, but there's other aspects of it. So I think the more technical assistance you could give to that employer might help in getting that accommodation. Does that make sense? You're welcome. Good question. Other questions, comments?
Graham, I think we've talked a little bit about tax incentives before in regards to employers who hire people who are living with a disability. So are you able to update us or any knowledge on that?
Well, I think the tax credits, there's a tax credit and deduction now for certain reasonable accommodations that the employer provides. So let's say the employer provides an interpreter, an ASL interpreter for a deaf person. They have these access expenditure tax credit or deduction that you have. The other tax credit that's out there is the work opportunity tax credit. And this is still in effect. It gives the employers a tax credit for hiring people with disabilities. That's basically in a nutshell. We're trying to get a state version of the work opportunity tax credit, and we ran into a little bit of resistance, but that's the way it usually is with legislation. So you run some resistance, you find out what your opposition, what their issues are, you try to make some adjustments. So we didn't even try to introduce it this time because the fourth year of the quadrennial, it's election. They got a lot of things, budgets. By the time to get all those, the likelihood of getting other additional piece of legislation is not that hard. But are we giving up? No. We're going to try to get a state version of the work opportunity tax credit. That's still on my legislative agenda. So is that what you meant by that? Is that your question?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Thank you. Good question. So tax credit, incentives for hiring people. I mean, people with disabilities are so great anyway. I can't believe that we actually need incentives for employers to hire us, okay? We make the best employees loyal, hardworking, and I'm not just saying that because I am one of you. I'm saying it because it's true.
Hey, Graham, I had a quick question.
Yes.
As Ms. Vegas was saying earlier about the sustainability of any of these current or existing incentives and ideas and visions, the sustainability is not there unless you have the capacity with trained support, especially to hire people with the most significant disabilities. So to me, that's a gap within a gap. So when it comes to our friends with, that want employment but cannot find the resources, whether they're in the waiver system or not in the waiver system, to have those paid supports, are there any possible transition type training academies for employers who want to hire these folks with the most significant disabilities, physical and cognitively, that could help support them and to create some type of program, and I hate to use the word program, but some type of toolkit within their organization that could help train, say, people that are natural supports, that have a passion to want to support Kyle at his job at their place of employment, but they may be part-time. So how can you bridge and say, okay, let's access these people, let's give the employers some real specific incentives that really get to the meat of the problem, which is supports, natural supports that have the competencies to support Kyle and be trained, and eventually Kyle would be, you know, those people he'd be weaned off, but you would have this ability to capture people, employees within an organization that could already be natural trained without relying on VR or for a provider or for an agency or me going out and trying to find a person that job coach can train. I mean, is there any visionary disability forward thinking occurring in those type of avenues with some of our employers? Because if we just got some of these large employers together and they sat down at the table with me, I could really show them some good ways of how they could really not just financially fund what could be done within employees in their own organization.
I think those are good ideas. I can't point you to a specific, like I don't like to use the word program, to a specific entity that's doing that, but I know that there may be some groups, employer organizations, HR organizations that maybe you could get with, you know, we could help train them and say, this could be a possible resource on training you on natural supports, so it doesn't have to come from a particular program that you think may be more sustainable. And because I think part of getting employers to hire people is letting them know that they can get some assistance in trying to make sure that's a good fit for the person and get the person in the job. And then once everything's figured out, then those things fade away. There's still a lot of fear out there. There's still a lot of misconceptions, and you think of all the myths about people with disabilities. I didn't go into those today, but that's what we're fighting against too, are myths about people with disabilities. Some people think that that they'll get sued if they eventually get sued if they hire somebody with a disability. But hey, I'm a lawyer, and somebody hired me and I never sued them, even though I'm really good at that, okay? So if they'll hire me, I think I'd say that tongue in cheek, but it's seriously, the point is helping dispel those myths about people with disabilities and the fears. And so what I think you're talking about would do that. You can say, look, it's not impossible to do these things, because a lot of them say, well, we don't know how to do it. We can't go through all that trouble to do it, you know. But if you show them the way, then I think the opportunity is going to be out there. It will expand opportunity. So I am willing, if you want to share that information with me, I'd welcome y'all to come visit me in my office and do it. Okay, two-part. This is like that back to school where Rodney Dangerfield's, and he's going part 16C 1-2, and he goes, and the answer is yes, and you are correct. Go ahead. What's the part 2? Is that a company in Alabama? All right. I would love to hear about it. And have you heard of a group called Disability In, which is, yeah, and Disability In is trying to work, and it's an employer-to-employer kind of organization where employers are talking to, or businesses are talking to other businesses. But it used to be called the business, I forgot the other name of it, but What is it? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Disability in. That is neat. Thank you for that. And I'm looking forward to getting that information from you. Please follow up. If you want to keep policymakers like myself, always do follow up and send an email. That gets my attention. You send me an email, I put that on my to-do list, which is pretty long, but I get to it every day. So it won't get buried somewhere in the bottom of a pile. I'll do my best. All right. What other questions do you have? Because I know y'all have had good questions though, so I'm not quite, it's 10 minutes, but I think they built in some extra time. Go ahead.
One more question.
Yeah, I'll give you my brag on here.
No, I was just going to brag on Graham, and I don't think I told this story when I met on the first class. If I did, y'all just bear with me. But I just want to say that that's kind of what PIP is all about, is networking and learning all these people. Graham and I have known each other now for longer than either one would like to admit to each other.
True.
But years ago, when one of my daughters, who's now an adult, was in middle school, and Kristen is very involved, uses a chair. She also happens to be African American, and that's pertinent to this story. Her 7th grade class was going to Birmingham to the Civil Rights Museum. And I got a phone call from the teacher saying, Jonna, I'm not sure Kristen's going to be able to go on the field trip. And I was like, what do you mean? And she said, well, we've contacted them, and they don't have a place for us to change and tube feed Kristen. And I was like, what? And they were like, we're perfectly willing to do it all, but they're saying they don't have a place to do it. So I called Graham, because I knew he was in Birmingham, and I knew accessibility type issues were really his thing. So I called Graham, and I said, okay, this is the situation, explain it to him, and he was pretty incredulous, and he was like, that can't be happening. And I was like, well, I just got off the phone. He said, hang on, let me make a couple of phone calls. Literally within the hour, I had the representative from the Jefferson area call me personally and say, Ms. Breland, your daughter will go. We will make sure there's a place for her to be changed and fed. And literally within 30 minutes, I had the Civil Rights Museum calling me saying, oh, yes, ma'am, we'll have a place for your daughter to be changed and fed. That would not have happened if I hadn't networked and didn't know somebody like Graham that knew somebody that could get things done. So use those connections, and Graham will help you in any way that he can. So when he says email me, call me, he means it.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. All right, thank you. All right, well, I think you have a question, because I don't want, because you remember the Gong Show where they had that big, and they like got the person off the stage with the big hook. So I'm seeing that hook has come my way, but I'll hurry up. Go ahead, ma'am.
I was just wondering, I thought it was loud enough.
It's for the people online. So
Oh,
we've
sorry.
got
I'm just joking. Just joking. I was curious as to, I know there are vendors for like rehab services and stuff, and I didn't get a chance to ask the other person, but how does one get to be a vendor for transition type services? Because we do need more providers of such services. And what's the process? Is there a phone number to call, and is there training or fees that you have to pay out?
My understanding the process
Recording in
is
progress.
we have a new accounting system. Well, not that new, but it's several years old, called STARS. And it's STAARS. And if you'll call me, I can try to get that information to you, but there's a way to register as a vendor in that system. And everybody has to register, even the people that attend my meetings and to get reimbursed for mileage have to register as vendors. So
Okay.
it's a pretty all-encompassing system. So,
That sounds good. Thank you so much.
oh, you're welcome. And I want to say thank y'all for listening this afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I appreciate y'all being here and learning about advocacy and networking, because we have to keep working towards this. We have to keep reminding folks about what's needed. People think the ADA was passed and all these other people with disabilities been working on it, everything's taken care of, but sometimes I feel like we go 2 steps forward and 1 step backwards. And so we need to keep working on it, be strong ambassadors for people with disabilities and for yourself. And I'd encourage you to be positive and be knowledgeable and informed. And thank you for giving me an opportunity today to give you some knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. We appreciate that, and great questions from the audience.